Hannah, on the basis of today, has the Prime Minister done enough to save his job?
Well, we certainly didn't see the deluge of criticism of him that we might have expected had he come to the House a couple of months ago, having just been fined by the police. His apology today was brief. He largely repeated what he had said previously to the press, and then he tried to move the conversation on and to focus on other things that he's been doing, primarily Ukraine, and to say that this is now the conversation we ought to be having. But I think it's still too early to say that he's managed to save himself, because there are still a lot of unknowns in the picture. We still don't know whether he will receive further fines, and we still don't know what the Sue Gray report will look like when it finally emerges.
And of course, Henry, ultimately the decision will probably be taken by Conservative MPs. What's the mood in the party this evening?
I think frustration more than anything else. Conservative MPs, compared to they have a historic reputation for ruthlessness when it comes to this kind of thing. But over the past few months, they really have given the Prime Minister quite a lot of leeway. They didn't manage to put together enough letters to trigger a vote of no confidence at the height of partygate when it first broke. And then gradually, because this story has come out in dribs and drabs and got worse incrementally, they seem to have adapted themselves to however bad it gets. I think a few months ago, as Hannah said, if he'd been fined, you would have seen much more anger. And if you told Tory MPs then that he would be fined and they sort of wouldn't do anything about it, I think some of them would have been quite surprised. I think the challenge will be if he gets fined again and potentially several more times, and each time has to come back to the House of Commons, each time has to give an explanation and an apology. I think this is going to get politically much more difficult to sustain. But for the moment, their forbearance for the Prime Minister is genuinely quite remarkable.
And on that point, Hannah, only one Conservative MP told him to quit in the Commons. Were you surprised by that?
Well, I wasn't really surprised, because nothing significant has changed in the calculation, I think, for lots of those MPs. I think that the idea that they've got used to the idea that he's been fined. I have to say that I think that Mark Harper, although he's not, he as chair of the COVID recovery group, was not a fan of Boris Johnson's COVID policies. He is a significant member of the party. He's a long-time MP, a former chief whip. So it wasn't a comfortable experience, I don't think, for Boris Johnson to have him stand up there and call for him to go.
And Henry, I suppose some other factors that might come into play. You were talking about further fines potentially, but also the council elections, the by-election Wakefield.
Yeah, I think the big one, the by-election is probably the big one. The local elections, I don't want to say that they're entirely priced in. We don't know how they'll go, and they could be really bad. But the Prime Minister and his allies have had that on the horizon for a while. They've been spinning, the bad result. The Tories have previously had a very good result, midterm blues, all the rest of it. I think Wakefield is potentially much more dangerous because it is a classic red wall constituency. It was won for the first time in 2019. I don't think many people expect the party to retain the seat, but I think that if they lose it very badly, then that will send a very dire warning to a lot of 29 intake MPs who feel maybe that they owe Boris Johnson their jobs and have that loyalty that a lot of first-time MPs have to the leader who got them elected. And I think that if they suddenly get this real solid evidence that they're a long way underwater in their own constituencies with potentially only a couple of years to go until the next election, that could change the dynamic more than the theatre in the House of Commons does.
And Hannah, was it your sense that Sir Keir Starmer hit home with his remarks?
Well, he very much tried to bring the personal back into this, I think, with Boris Johnson having said, well, let's move on to the other important issues that the country is facing. Boris Johnson tried to bring it back to what has been making people angry about what happened at Westminster and Whitehall. He tried to bring it back to the experiences of people during the pandemic, and to remind the public who, as Henry said, I think some of the attention to this is dissipated in the public. He was trying to remind them of why they had been so annoyed by this when it first emerged.
And Henry, a vote on a Commons investigation on Thursday, is that an added complication?
Yeah, potentially. Not least because it does pose some tricky question to the Prime Minister. If he votes against it, then his opponents will say that he knows he's guilty, because otherwise, if he had nothing to hide, why wouldn't he vote for it? But if he votes for it, obviously, and it happens, it could end up being very tricky for him. I think this whole issue, basically the problem with the Prime Minister is that the longer we dwell on this issue, the worse it is for him. You can see this. His entire strategy is trying to move on, trying to move the agenda onto Ukraine, onto levelling up, onto anything else. And simply, you can see whether or not he loses his job, whether or not Tory MPs rebel against him. You can see in the polls that this has done enormous damage to his standing and to the party's standing. They're now consistently underpolling Labour. And I think that kind of corrosive background damage is going to carry on happening, whether or not there's a sort of spectacular explosion that sees him deposed. And so I think he's rightly worried about that, but I don't know if there's all that much he can do about it. The logic of this is that it's simply being dragged out. There's one thing after another, and it simply won't leave the headlines.
And how do you see that vote and investigation going, Hannah?
Well, I think it is pretty unlikely on Thursday that MPs will vote for it. So I think it is probably unlikely to happen. The indications are that the government is going to whip MPs not to vote to have that investigation, and so it will be stopped in its tracks at that point. If it were to go ahead, then the committee would conduct an investigation, and then they would report back to the House, and the House would have to vote on whether they would agree with the committee's findings. That would be another opportunity for it, decision point, I guess, for the government whips to decide what to do about that.
Dr. Hannah White, Henry Hill, thank you both for joining us in Scotland Tonight.
Thank you.